Alright, so today I'm gonna make a video on how I harvest one of the buckets and it's completely full. Here we have one of the bins. This is our medium size bin, and here's the castings with some worms, but as you can see, it's fully broken down from what we started with as bedding and food for the worms. So what I like to do is right off the top, because a lot of the worms are sitting closer to the top of the bin, I like to scoop out a small container full. This is about maybe a 2-liter container, and the whole idea is this becomes the base for the new bin, or when we get things started again. So this will have worms, it'll have some castings, but pretty much it's the environment that the worms have been living in, and this will just get things off and going, so the worms aren't starting completely from scratch. And I just set this aside. So this, like I said, it has worms, it may have some eggs and some finished castings. So I just set that aside for now because we don't really need it for a while. So in keeping with how I also get the extract out, kind of clean everything at once, both get the castings and any extract. I'll just lift that out and set it into another bucket that's about the same size as the one at the bottom. And here we have the extract. You can also see that there's some castings there, and there's probably a few worms that made it down. This one looks pretty good. It doesn't look like there's a lot of worms in there, so that's fine. I mean, either way, we tend not to lose any worms just because we're straining this stuff when we pour it into our extract container. So over here, we'll just pour it in. So I already have the paint strainer attached to a basket, so that will capture any worms and any of the bigger particles of worm castings as well. So we'll mostly just have a good liquid base down there. Now I like to give this a good rinse with some water that we collected from when we were pulping the newspaper. And again, this just gets any worms and sediments out. It doesn't have to be super clean. And this will all end up again into the strainer. Sometimes when we're harvesting, we get a lot more worms. Sometimes it's a very thick base of casting, so it's not as liquidy. But process is essentially the same. So we'll leave this to drain here into this container, and that stuff will go into the extract bucket, which we aerate, and like I said in the past, we'll use that to water and feed some of our plants and veg. So now that this is clean, I'll actually just bring it over, set it aside for the time being. So this is the part that requires a little bit of finesse. Over here I have my continuous flow through container that I've built out of a rain barrel, and the reason why I ended up using this rain barrel is the little spigot broke at the bottom, and rather than throw it out, I just converted it into a larger bin. This step isn't absolutely necessary, but I've found that as I'm screening castings, or when I was screening castings in the past, I was coming across quite a few eggs that hadn't hatched out, and there's always the risk of damaging the eggs and not getting a hatch, and that's a bit of a waste in terms of the whole productive cycle of the worms. So we decided to put everything into a CFT, continuous flow through container. The worms that are in there will hatch out, and as we harvest from the bottom, we're getting mostly castings. We do still get some worms, but I hardly ever see any eggs coming out from the bottom, so that's a good thing from that perspective. Some folks like to just put everything through a screen and then harvest the eggs at that point. It can be a bit of a violent process on both the worms and the eggs, so this is a little better way, I think, to harvest things out. So I'm just using the cultivator tool here to pull the castings out, and it's kind of wet. It's not super wet, and that's just because we've been allowing this material to drain as it forms, so not a lot of excess moisture. It'll still clump, as you're seeing here, and you can see some of the worms. So this is going to be their new home for the next little while, until they work their way through the bottom and end up going in another bin at some point down in the future. So just keep pulling here. Now this material isn't very dense, but as it settles over time, it does get pretty dense, and that's really why it doesn't just fall right through the space between the PVC tubes. In fact, you kind of have to work to get that stuff out when you are harvesting. Some of it will fall through a bit at a time, but most of it will stay in place unless you go underneath with a tool like this to harvest the material out. So some larger operations use a bar. Pretty much it's a large rectangular container where they're feeding through the top and harvesting from the bottom, and they'll have a bar attached to a winch that they'll actually just drag along the bottom of the container, and it acts as a rake pulling the finished castings out, and that's material would collect on the ground, and they'd maybe dry it out for a little bit and then harvest it up, screen it, and then it's ready for sale. This is a much smaller operation. This is in my basement. It's more than enough for me. It's enough so I can sell some, but it's not a large-scale commercial operation. So just to finish things up here as far as emptying the bin, at the top, or what was the bottom I should say, of the bin, you have castings that's collected. Just stuff that's come through the drain holes and collected at the bottom. And again, this is perfectly good castings. This material is quite a bit wetter than what was in the bucket, and just like to just work most of it off. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I try to get as many of the worms that might be out here as possible, just so that they're back in the system. They're not doing anything productive once they've come out of the working bucket. So just try to make sure there aren't any there. And that should be good enough. So just a quick little cleaning. You can get a bit more of this material out. I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen a lot of videos on YouTube that show this part of the workings as far as worm farm operations. Partly some of them are more mechanized, and a lot of the other ones are just home systems that people are just using for their personal kitchen scraps. So this was the bin that we cleaned out. This is the working bin, or pail. Sorry, interchangeable. Here's the lid. So now we're going to set this up as a new system. So what I have here in this container, it's the coarser material that has come through the my hand-operated trommel, and I'll make a video that actually shows the whole screening process. This is 1/8 of an inch square hardware cloth. I've cut 2 buckets down, and the buckets, it doesn't matter what buckets you use. It'd be good to have the lid of one, and if they're the same diameter, that's great. And I've basically wrapped the hardware cloth around the buckets. On the output side, the hardware cloth is inside the bucket, and on the input side, it's on the outside, and that just allows for none of the castings to kind of work their way out. It basically goes through the whole system, feeds through, and then all the larger bits come out of the end. I fasten the hardware cloth to the buckets using some screws and some washers, and on the receiving side, I basically cut a hole in the lid just so that there's a nice lip, so that I don't have to worry about castings popping out as I'm turning it. Now this, I was fortunate to find this at a store where it was the base of a fixture that they had, and all it is 4 casters that are swiveled on a rectangular frame. I don't see why someone couldn't build something like this simply using pieces of wood and some casters. And the swivel is nice in that it moves and allows the casters move and maintains good contact with the trommel as you're turning it. And I have a little bit of wood here. This is I think a 1x4, and that just gives a little bit of elevation at the front so that the material actually is moving down through the system. If it was flat, I'd probably get more stuff screened, but it would just take quite a bit longer. Anyways, this is the output from that. And so when I start a new pail, what I'd like to do is get a sheet of newspaper and just put it in the bottom. Now this newspaper will break down over time because it's going to be in constant contact with the material, and the worms will actually work at it. But the reason why I like to do this is because at the startup, I don't have to worry about worms escaping right away. Here's a barrier, but it's because it's paper, any excess liquids will still move down through it. And so just because there are holes, I don't know if I showed those really clearly, but there's, let's open this up a little bit. So there are all these holes, they're a little bit clogged, but quite a few holes in the bottom of the working bucket. And the whole idea is everything drains out that doesn't need to be in there. So this acts as a temporary barrier. So I'm going to grab a couple of scoopfuls of this, of the coarser castings, and it has quite a bit of eggshells in it too. And that's just because we're using kitchen scraps from home and restaurants, and a lot of these restaurants do process go through a lot of eggs. The shells are great because they act as a bit of abrasive material for the worms that they then use to help digest and process the food as they're eating it. But it also acts as a buffer to help maintain a good pH level in the system. And because you do not want a system that gets very acidic, so the eggshells are great that way. Some people will put lime and other things in, but honestly this is free and it does the job. So once most of the paper is covered up, I know I don't have any points where things can leak out. And you know, again, if you're just doing this for personal use, you don't even have to go through the whole screening process. You can use standard bedding material to get things going again. I just like to have a finely screened end product. So this coarser stuff, I just recirculate it, and it'll start to break. It'll break down again. It'll get wet. It'll be pliable, and so nothing goes to waste in that sense. So now that we have that part of the system set up again, we will grab our container that has the worms and the finished castings, and we toss them in there. So we already have the beginnings of really good medium for the worms to get to work. They'll probably stay in this moisture layer for now, but as things wet out through and through, then they'll just be a lot more mobile. So the next bit is just a repeat of a previous video that I did that showed how I do the feed. You can definitely fast forward to this part, or if you haven't watched that video, I'll show you. This is the pulp newspaper, which I've used a paint stir to break down in water, and then I've pressed out a lot of the excess moisture, and so I work it with the cultivator tool again just to loosen things up. And once it's somewhat loosened up, I'll grab my scoop and we'll get a few scoops of the compost that we brought in from outside. And this compost is pretty broken down, and it doesn't have to be allowed to break down to this level. I think that was about maybe 3.5 scoops there, because we're really just trying to get our kitchen scraps, coffee grounds and such, all the high nitrogen components of our compost to heat up and then start to cool down, so that we don't have to worry about dealing with that in the worm buckets. Additionally, if we had a lot of fruit and there were eggs from fruit flies and other things like that, but we really don't want inside, this is a way to deal with that as well. This partially composted material from outside, any flies that were there have long since gone, and there's no odor. It's actually fairly dry material, and that's why it helps to have the pulp paper as wet as it is, because it does balance the moisture in the system a little bit. So that's more or less pretty worked in, and what you're going to notice is I'm not measuring that much how much of this material, once it's mixed fairly evenly, I'm putting into the bin, because in the years I've been doing this, I have not really had an overfeeding issue. There are times when I'll come back and to the bucket and it's not fully broken down, but there's no risk of the system being anaerobic. The worms do their thing, and in fact, if I have to go away even for several weeks, a month, if I just top up the systems with extra material, the worms are fine when I get back. There's less disturbance of the system, and when I come back to it, when I cycle through all the bins I have, which is 84, pretty much everything's broken down and ready either for the next feeding or for harvesting. And so here we are, and this stuff will take several weeks to break down, but the moisture is going to be great, the food supply is going to be good, the worms in that container, they're going to reproduce, and continue to work on this. And it's as maintenance free as one gets. So that's pretty much it. This is a rebuilt system. It'll go back on the shelf, and I'd just move on to the next one. So there you have it. That's how I harvest a full bucket and get it going again. And if someone was going to be starting a worm farm from scratch, some of these stages are essentially what you'd have to do. Maybe not as much material, again, because often you're just putting straight kitchen scraps in. But that is it, and we are good to go. Thanks for watching.